Hi all, I'm Gabriela Houston. Welcome to my show where we talk about storytelling in all its forms. Today's guest is Suswati Basu. She is an award-winning editor and journalist. She won the Emma Humphreys Memorial Prize for raising awareness on domestic violence, has been shortlisted for the Guardian Mary Stott Prize, and has also been longlisted for the Guardian International Development Journalism Award. She also has an award-nominated podcast, How to Be Books, 24/7, that focuses on mental health. Welcome to the show, Suswati.
Thank you so much for having me, Gabriela. It's lovely to be here.
So I suppose we should start with, how did you come to do all the very wonderful and extremely varied things that you do?
Oh God, this is a really long story. It's a really odd one because apparently psychologically or subconsciously I'd been planning to be a journalist since I was a kid, just without even realizing. So at the age of 12, I found a small folder where my teacher had written a note in it saying, I hope you get to live in China one day and become a journalist. And that's what I ended up doing without even realizing. So I just sort of geared towards it without even realizing that was happening.
That's so impressive. I mean, how many 12-year-olds actually get to, achieve their dreams
It's
later on?
very odd though. It's just sort of like, oh wow, I was very subconsciously like channeling something, and that ended up in doing exactly that. But yeah, I have a older half cousin who's also a BBC journalist who kind of inspired me as a kid to be like, go and platform interesting stories and interesting voices and marginalized people and things like that. And that sort of half activism, half sort of journalistic side sort of inspired me to just kind of keep moving in that direction. So, by the time I was like 17, 18, I was doing lots of like fundraising and activism work and basically just volunteering my summers to do the fundraising essentially. So I was at the London Feminist Network, where I was at Workers' Beer, working at festivals, raising money and things like that. And then, I was helping organize lots of big marches, so Reclaim the Night in 2006. And then also in 2007, then we did Million Women Rise. And so I was just part of lots of sort of grassroots network of women's organizations for a very, very long time. And then basically I was like, okay, I'm sort of also doing bits of journalism in the middle of that. So I was just like writing articles here and there. And then, I just had this idea of like, I'm going to just, try a few of these competitions out, and started writing and got somewhere with it, which was really helpful. So I ended up getting an opportunity to work at the Guardian on the G2 magazine at that time, which was where the women's pages were. So I was just very excited to be with Kira Cochrane at the time, who was the editor of the G2 magazine. And, I was able to help her with lots of articles and then basically contact lots of women, fabulous women who I was like completely like, idolized. And so I was really excited to have that opportunity to do that. And then, I went into uni, carried on my activism work. So I was the president of the Women's Society. So we were always like doing lots of work. So things like misogynist pageants and things like that we were fighting against. And, it was always very, very active sort of
It sounds like you
what we
were
were doing.
extremely focused from very early on. And I think it's so lovely to have somebody close to you who can recognize all that energy that you carry with you and help you to channel it.
Yeah. I'm like,
And
it was sort of like, I think because I had a really troubled upbringing, it really helped spur me on because I was really alone doing all these things. But the fact that I was just like, this is for someone who was like me, so it kind of helped me sort of keep working at it. Everything I did was in mind that someone else out there would need the same support. So I was basically just doing what I was doing in order to make the world a bit better. So it was really important for me. Like activism's a really big part of my life because I know what it's like to live in the hardship. So
I
and all
see. So
those,
you were linking it to your own story
yeah.
and how
This is
it's
how I got involved in the first place because I was in a really bad place, and basically the right people found me at the right time. And so I was able to use and channel that, energy where I was just like, it's either that I'm not going to make it, so I've got to have to keep fighting. So that fighting spirit kind of stayed there on everything I did, which is why I'm like always activism is like a very big part of my life. But that's why journalism is really important to me, because even though media gets a really bad rap, of course, especially now, for me, we all go in it with a pure heart, trying to make the world a better place for people who don't have voices. So that's generally, especially if you come from a background like ours, where you don't come from the standard, you know,
mm.
box essentially. We come with lots of stories with us. So yeah, yeah. Hence being in journalism after all these years.
Now that's
17 years.
incredible because you see the stories that you cover and stories that you read, and the thing is that the way you curate it and the way you curate sort of your energy is linked to your own story and how you sort of want to bring your experiences to sort of help others. And when I was looking at your blog and sort of just listening to your podcast a bit, I was thinking about how it sort of all links. And I just wanted to sort of start with the very title of your blog and podcast, How to Be 24/7. So that in itself sounds like quite a mission statement. So can you sort of tell us where that came from?
Yeah, it was really funny. So basically, okay. So I worked in one of the most challenging fields, apart from obviously medicine and things like that, which was 7 years in counterterrorism, and it was really, really intense. And also, you really feel very helpless when you're watching it and not being able to do anything. So it started to become an outlet where I was just like, I need to be able to deal with some of these sort of feelings that I'm sort of having to process every day. And the other aspect of it was like podcasting, it was still quite a new format at that point. So in 2020 and pandemic, podcasts became a really big thing at that point where everyone just started because obviously they're all stuck at home. And I am actually petrified of public speaking, which is, I know, slightly insane given my job, but it's always been like a big fear of mine. I've always had very severe stage fright. So I was like, I need to be able to deal with this in a kind of a productive way, as I usually do things that way. So I was like, okay, aversion therapy. I'm going to see this as aversion therapy, which is I'm going to jump in the deep end and try and speak inside a mic and do this. And I was like, okay, so that's one thing. At the same time, obviously, I was diagnosed with a really rare condition in 2017. So my body has been slowly degenerating. So in 2017, my arms started to go, and then my right leg went, and eventually my legs are more or less sort of 50% now. So, I use mobility aid, I have a wheelchair and things like that. And so lockdown for me was kind of normal because I'd already done this before. Um, but I was just like, I need to be able to process all of these different things that are happening. And I was like, I got stuck in 2017 just inside for a whole year because I couldn't move at all. And so I was just totally bedridden. And I was like, what shall I do during this time? And I just read and I read and I read and I read. So I read like close to 380 books that year because I was just like, I had so much time on my hands. But what it did was just it ignited my love of reading again, which was really quite nice actually. And I was just like, okay, so I continued that kind of like, I'm going to just keep reading, even though, I'm going back to work and things like that. So I was like, okay, so I've got the reading aspect down. I've got to get better at public speaking. And I was like, okay, I've also got to channel my activism somehow into something productive. And there started to form this idea of like, okay, I've got to create something. So How to Be books essentially came one night, like halfway through the night. I just sort of woke up and was like, "Well, oh, that's right. That's something I heard, which was really important. Which was we need to stop being human, human doings. We are human beings." And I was like, that's a really, really important thing we need to hold on to, because I'd wrapped my identity so much around doing things that I felt really
Activism, being active,
activism.
yeah, in
Absolutely. So, my identity was like a journalist, an activist. And I was like, this is problematic, because what happens when all of those labels start to go? What happens to your foundation? And I was like, I need to be able to sit with the fact that I can't do any of these things anymore. So I was just like, okay, so I've got to think of the idea of being a human being again. And so the idea of how to be sort of came about, because I was just like, okay, we need to be able to sit with ourselves. And that is kind of the fundamental aspect of it, which is understanding social skills, life skills, and also just relearning a lot of things that we might not really understand. And we just live life like every day as like sort of in a chaotic way. And I was just like, this is time to start talking about these different areas. And obviously, it's branched into lots of other areas like social affairs and things like that, because these things affect everyone on a daily basis. And so I think that's why it's such a large conversation. But yeah, and that's how it came about. It's quite a lot.
literally how to be 24/7 rather than doing things 24/7.
Exactly. Yeah.
That is even more interesting than I thought it would be as an explanation for the show. I'm very sorry that you had to go through that, but I do admire this intent with which you sought to find a new way of doing similar things, because this whole podcast and this whole sort of blog that you're doing, it's all still very much targeted at helping people, and that's very impressive. Now, in terms of the format of your blog and book reviews and podcast, you bring in a lot of very varied books, a lot of
Mm,
very different people coming in. And in my show, we're sort of focusing on storytelling
yeah.
as being more than just literally telling stories.
Yeah.
Um, and what sort of interests me is how all the books you select, while they're very different from each other, they all still fit into what seems to me to be a coherent narrative. So, would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I think so, because I think I go in it with a slight agenda. Like in terms of when I start talking to people, I have an idea of what, having read their books, of course, like what their kind of motivations are. And then when you ask them questions, like what they may say, you always get some interesting bits out of it as well. But there is a, I'm going with it with an angle, because obviously everything I try and look at, I look in an intersectional point, like in a way intersectional way, just because obviously people's identities are so varied, and it's really easy to just lump them within just one identity, and people have so many identities. So I think that's the storytelling aspect I find really interesting, because it is so varied. And that way, for example, when I spoke to, of course, like, was really lucky to speak to Dr. Shirin Ebadi, who's obviously Nobel Peace Prize winner, and her story is just remarkable. It is just horrific, obviously, what she went through, and she continues to fight in her 70s. She continues to fight. She's had family constantly harassed and imprisoned. She's been exiled from the country, and I think there was always something really interesting to hear what she had to say. And one of those things was, the fact that she was the first female judge in Iran. And then within like the first year, 1979, her role was stripped away from her, because obviously the Shah, the regime came in. So, those are like the stories that I find really kind of interesting, in terms of like it affects us all in that small way, even though they're so far away from us. her women's rights, the fight for her women's rights, the way she's doing it still affects everyone across the world who are also fighting that story. So, it shows up in lots of different ways. So it's just like quite
Of
interesting.
course. I think it's also, like we tend to, in this country and in most of Europe for sure, we tend to think about anywhere outside of Europe, outside of the US, as being far away and
Mm,
sort of almost surprised when we find a link to that place. Whereas this world has just shrunk so much and everything is so connected, like when there's war in Ukraine, when there's
yeah,
hunger in Yemen, like it's we are so interconnected, and I think it's so important to talk about it more openly in a kind of mainstream media to sort of
yeah,
not shy away from that, and not just in terms of our immediate interests, but also in terms of long term, like how do we want to be,
yeah,
how do we want to treat each other, how are we, how can we build those bridges to sort of avoid the knock on effect that certain events might have.
yeah,
And I liked how kind of your blog seems to sort of link all those different stories and different people, and sort of on the topic of marginalization. I was listening to an interview of Why We Fear Money,
yeah,
Women Talk Money, with editor Rebecca Walker.
yeah. She's
Uh,
fantastic.
it was so good, and I was what sort of struck me is also in relation to your selection of titles as a whole, is how consistently you select those titles that focus on how to help women and marginalized communities overcome a sort of self marginalization.
Yeah,
And I was wondering why those topics are important to you. I mean, some of it you've answered already in talking about, your early, very early life, and what sort of spurred you on to activism. But is it something that you still see as a big issue in this country as well, or abroad, or in marginalized communities here? How do you see that?
yeah. I think things are also unraveling quite fast as well. I feel like a lot of things in this country are actually going backwards. And so, especially after the pandemic, during the pandemic, there was a huge backlash to the fact that all these women were made redundant, lost their jobs because they were then forced to essentially take on the main carer role again. And, we all these hard won sort of things that we've managed to fight for so long just got rolled back um, massively. So actually, there's still so much work to be done. And so I think, this is why I will continue to highlight it. And you're right in terms of like the self marginalization, but also just kind of realizing that this fight isn't just like particular communities, it's such a global fight against the same things. So, for example, when I looked at book banning, yeah, I'm looking at a lot of sort of American book banning because the majority of the most sort of widespread book banning we're seeing in the media is in America. But that doesn't mean this isn't happening in Russia, this isn't happening in Mongolia. And so this is why I've also covered all these other areas in the world where this is happening, because it's exactly the same problem. And so I think especially in the West, we get very bogged down with they look like us and therefore we will cover this story. We think about, okay, how many Brits were injured in a particular accident or something like that. That's the first thing how we sort of portray and sort of cover events just to make it relevant for readers. And I think that's kind of a problematic because it others people.
For sure, and it creates a particular kind of narrative
Yeah,
that these stories are important and the other stories are like, but nothing is happening in
yeah,
those places. And it's interesting when you look at, like, when you pick up like Le Monde Diplomatique, right,
mm,
and
yeah,
then you pick up the Guardian, or time, like, Sunday Times or whatever,
mm,
and you compare the two, and there's just such myopic sort of view on what is sort of being sold here as the kind of the news, the front new, front page news.
Yeah.
And I think it's, but again, like, people produce those stories thinking this is what people are interested in, and maybe there's a
Yeah.
truth in that, so how do we switch that narrative and make people realize that this is relevant to them?
I think it's a case of the more representation, the more digestible it becomes. And the problem is we haven't even broached that because we're too scared, especially losing readership. And in a time where the media is going through a massive sort of just total change, sea change, it's really now reluctant to go against the grain. That's why suddenly you're seeing so much more like right wing people being platformed and things like that, just so that they can keep people on side. And I think
Mm.
that's slightly problematic because obviously, you know, of course, free expression is free expression, but there's also hate speech, which is a whole other thing, and we aren't doing enough to kind of counter that either. And so I think, we really still have so much to do in terms of representation. And, don't get me started on the Shamima Begum story, which I think is just atrocious. To strip a young
Yeah.
girl of their citizenship says a lot about the country because, she looks like us, we look like her. And it says a lot about how they treat people who do not look like them. And so I think that's why I said there's a space where this needs to be addressed, where other people in this country need a place where they're like, okay, I feel I'm being represented somewhere. And the mainstream media is not doing a good job of that at the moment.
No, I think that, like, one of the issues is with sort of fact checking, and that's something that I will tie in with a question slightly later on. Is that people, I think, crave a little bit more certainty, which is
Yeah.
not always being provided, because people are so. And that is an issue that, is very noticeable both on the left and right
Yeah.
sort of side of
It's big.
politics, is that the deterioration of the sort of level of debate, with fewer facts being
Oh, yeah.
presented, and that's honestly, but all sides, all political
Yeah.
sides, I've
It is.
noticed, people will provide anecdotal evidence,
Yeah.
instead of real statistics, for example,
Yep.
because we're scared of the real statistics,
Yeah.
because it feels like there's just, it's harder to spin.
Yeah.
And what um, what people actually have, I've noticed, enjoy, like, on social media, is when social media bring in those little warnings, as in, like,
Yeah.
there's inaccuracy in the statement. This photo is actually from somewhere else than the author of the photo. So I think more of that would go a long way towards restoring this faith in that there is, not always objective truths, because that is, you can have facts. The
Yeah.
facts are objective, but the truths that we sort of glean from them is a different matter altogether, isn't it? I think.
Yeah.
And I think we need to sort of allow ourselves to see more than one side of a story, because I think when people sort of get divided alongside, like, well, if you vote for Tories, then you have
Yeah.
to believe in this, or if you vote for Labour, you have to believe in that, and we don't allow for any dissent on
Not
either
even a
side,
bit. No.
then stories like Shamima Begum are going to be a bit more common, aren't they? Because it's like, you're aligned with this, and so you can only see her in a particular way. And, like,
Yeah.
there are facts about Shamima Begum that everyone agrees on,
Yeah. Absolutely.
but how we see those facts and how we interpret them, that's what's ending up causing this current situation. And it's just very sad for her family, and it's
Yeah.
just it's but I think that, in a way, her situation is that I feel like everyone's at fault.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
I like I
Completely. she was a
it's
child. I think this
yeah.
is the fundamental thing. She was a child when it happened, and I think it's so scary to think that we're once again victim blaming, with blaming women again in this
Mm.
situation, in a situation where she was groomed. And I was just like, this is a really terrifying situation because she doesn't look like your traditional victim. And I think we're having the same conversation over and over again, just in different forms now. And I totally agree with you. I think the advent of social media has just been catastrophic for the media. We just never saw this coming, because when I was working in digital media, so when I first joined digital media in 2012, it was still all new. Everything was going on, social media and things like that. But there was this place for citizen journalism, and there was definitely, the Arab Spring was happening, and so people were really keen on, like, people on the ground taking footage and things like that, and it was really exciting. And then it just quickly started to warp into this totally other realm of essentially bandwagoning on social media, where there's just absolutely no form of communication or debate, and instead you have these just vacuum echo chambers of people only listening to people like them or us. And it's just
Yes.
created this
And
insane
purposefully
divide.
misinterpreting people's words as well, which I
100%.
find, I mean, we could come up with many examples, I'm sure, of that
Yeah,
in particular, but it's just, purposefully taking something someone said out of context, and
completely.
that what you're saying is not accurate, and yet you still do it because it helps you fit into their,
Yeah.
yeah, like
The narrative.
somebody disagrees with you, and then you can say like, well, this person clearly wants me dead.
Yeah, pretty much.
And that ends all communication. That ends,
Yeah.
like, a statement like that ends any chance at a debate.
Yeah.
And but like
And
you say,
this is
mm,
exactly why I was just like, we need to have a space where we can have this like conversation, even if it's uncomfortable. Which is why I had a whole year of sitting there on Twitter Spaces and Clubhouses, having really uncomfortable conversations with people, because I was like, we need to talk about it, even if
mm,
it's a differing views. Everyone gives me lots of different views every week on the podcast, and I don't mind it at all. That is the point. That is the point. It's like,
yeah,
no one is right, no one is wrong. And I think that
exactly.
that we need to have that space to do that.
I think you're absolutely right, but it's just becoming such a rare quality to be able to listen to people you disagree with very strongly, and yet do it in a way that sort of furthers our understanding, because it's supposed to be about the search for, like, the truth. It's supposed to be about the search for some kind of commonality, and
Yeah.
just common ground, and it becomes of a way to sort of further distract and
Yeah.
divide, and
Yeah. Like,
and
Gabriela, I'm an atheist, but I did a whole episode on trying to understand faith with an LGBTQ background. So I found loads of people who were hardcore, like pastors, Christians, who are also gay, and I was like, that is the point. Is that
of
I
course.
might not believe in it, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong.
And well, most importantly, I think it doesn't mean that it's not important, because it is important to
Exactly.
people's life.
Yeah.
So when you see, I like yourself, I'm an atheist, so I but I find it really interesting. I often watch videos of linguists comparing Bible translations,
Very interesting.
because I find it so fascinating,
Yeah.
because you again, this is something that, we have this storytelling element where we approach a text with a particular worldview or understand,
Mm,
like, linguistic understanding, and then when we retell the story, you're telling a completely different story,
yeah,
and the sort of the original context gets lost,
completely. Hmm.
and sort of going towards the sort of unreliable narrator. Speaking of, I had noticed that you review a great deal of biographies
Yeah,
and autobiographies,
I
and I
do.
found that very interesting. So, bringing it back to the storytelling element, you're telling your readers a story of how someone else told their life story, or even, a third degree of separation. You're telling a story of how someone else told the life story of someone else.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I was thinking about all those sort of multiplied layers of interpretation. And, first you have this, interpretation of one's own life. And that is, always, my recollection of my childhood events will be so different to my brother's recollection of my childhood events, or my father's, And so, in itself, you have a very tinted
Completely
view.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you approach people's sort of representation of their own story?
This is the thing. Yes, so basically reading autobiography is really interesting because obviously there's a layer of sort of context that you have to understand, which is that people are writing within the perspective of their own life. And obviously that's very, very subjective. And so the people around in their life is actually probably has a completely different point of view of the same situation. And I always say this just specifically for certain autobiographies, which is the ones that, there's a lot of hype around, especially if it's a very prolific person. There's a reason, there's an agenda behind it of what the message they want to portray within the book. Otherwise, usually there's no point in putting an autobiography out unless there's a selling point. But I think with the general autobiographies, like the one I read recently, which is absolutely stunning, which is How to Say Babylon by Safia Sinclair, who's an incredibly gifted poet from Jamaica. She's writing completely some horrific events that happened in her life from her point of view, but there isn't that very, very strong agenda that is in a lot of the celebrity autobiographies. So I read 970 pages of Barbara Streisand's book. Yes, I did, within like 2 days, which gave me quite a headache, I have to say. But you can quite clearly see the reason why she'd written the book.
I saw the review. Was it like 900 pages of self-validation, you called it?
Yeah, completely. The thing is, Babs has a big reputation of being a diva, of being difficult, and you can see that she's trying really hard to sort of create an explanation for a lot of that behavior of or why, for example, she behaves a certain way, but then also in a way why it's justified. So this was 900 pages of that.
I find it so sad that nobody actually told her, like, you don't need to do this. Like, you're Barbara Streisand. Like, you really don't need to do this.
No, you've done everything. You've won at life. You've won at life. Like, literally, you don't need to do this. It's kind of bizarre in a way. It was really bizarre because I was just like, she doesn't really need to do this at all. She's done absolutely everything. She's incredibly successful. So it was really weird to read it because I was just like, okay, that I am counting all the times she's using the word like, I just want to be kind of like trusted and loved by my mother, and you can see that, and it's really it does sort of give you a little bit of understanding of like why she behaves the way she does, but you also need to understand that there is an angle for the book for a reason. Otherwise,
I think there's always an angle. Like, we might sort of say there isn't, but obviously there's always an angle, and it's interesting when you sort of read someone's story and then you glean another story behind it. Because, the things they're not saying. And especially when it comes to people who sort of feel strongly that they want to tell their own story because somebody else is telling it for them, and they want to be in control of their own narrative. And I think, especially so in such cases, you feel like, you read it maybe with a more skeptical view because you see they're pushing against something, you know, like when you mentioned people calling Barbara Streisand difficult. I mean, I hadn't heard of that personally, but then it doesn't surprise me because I think all successful and energetic women
Yeah.
have been, you know, called difficult at some point in their
Absolutely.
life,
Yeah.
and it's just sad when they actually feel feel it so keenly that they need
Yeah.
to then explain it away. But you know, it's like when Prince Harry sort of
Spare. Mm.
released that that sort of autobiography, and I mean, I hadn't actually read it. I have
Yeah.
to full disclosure, I hadn't read it, but
I had to read it in a day for work,
in a
do a review.
day, oh my god,
Yeah, I
that's
sat
quite a
for 15
volume.
hours. Yeah,
And
just
what was your
read it.
view of that as a kind of like him telling his own story? Like how what was your view of that?
It was really interesting because I could see someone who was very damaged, and it was really sad, because
Mm.
it had a very childlike voice all the way through, which I thought was really sad. And it was really interesting then reading Omid Scobie's book, just that came out recently, because I wanted to kind of compare the two books. Omid Scobie's books, obviously, it's more kind of favourable towards the
For
Sussex.
those of us who don't know what you're talking about, can you please explain what that other book is?
Right, so it's been very controversial, but Omid Scobie was a really like top royal correspondent for ABC News, and he came out with a new book. He's already done one about the Sussexes before, but he's created a new book essentially called Endgame, which is what he describes as essentially the trajectory, which is the fall of the monarchy. And so there's a lot of obviously his own agenda, because obviously he is more favourable towards the Sussexes. He's had a huge backlash in British media, as you can imagine, because
Mm.
obviously it's very, very heavily royalist. And so it was really interesting to use that book and also compare to Spare as well. It's both, you know, coming from the point of view of the Sussexes, I would say. And so obviously there is an agenda, but I found Spare so much more poignant because some of it was just so devastating, because, you know, we all sat there and we watched him, you know, following his mother's coffin as a child, and
Yes.
it's personal, you know, as people who grew up in the UK, we all watched that, you know, that horrific funeral.
I mean, I didn't
um
grow up in the UK, and I still
yeah,
watched it, you know,
yeah,
as a child,
exactly.
and it was it's so strange because the whole
So
world
strange.
watched it, and I
Just
think,
sat there like,
and you
how can
get
you make a 11-year-old do that, you know? um
absolutely, and you have this like other level of like the way that people look and tell those stories, like. So I've been watching The Crown, and the earlier
yeah.
seasons
Oh
are
yeah.
marvelous. But
Yes, but
in
the
this
latter,
latest season, you know, I've been watching it, and it makes me so uncomfortable
very.
in a kind of, for one, the a lot of it seems to be completely made up. Like I mean, I have not heard of any factual basis for a lot of the interpretations that you get that are very unfavorable to sort of Al Fayed and
Yeah,
his son, to a kind of to the point of caricature.
yeah,
And
it is.
I mean, in a way, I mean, it's good that it didn't sort of wasn't released during his lifetime, because it's
Yeah,
just vicious, I think. And I mean, I'm sorry to say, like I do see like a definite racist element in how he's
yeah,
depicted in this kind of Orientalist
very.
sort of conniving Arab sort of way,
Yeah,
and that is, uh, and that would be so uncomfortable to watch when you were sort of so closely, you know, close to those events, you know, as the two princes were.
yeah, and that's what you see in the books. It is really telling, actually, because I think Spare is one of. There's a reason why it was such a big bestseller. It's the biggest bestseller this year. Where, you know, you see a whole different side of the monarchy, to the point that it is destabilizing.
Mm.
And he said some really harsh truths about the current queen and the things that they did, the media machine, the relationship they have with the media is really troubling. And Omid Scobie's book basically reiterates this from a much sort of more kind of researched point of view, which is looking at the history of courtiers within the court, essentially, which is what it is, and all the secretaries that manipulate all the kind of messaging around the monarchy. And so it goes much more into further detail about it, which again, there are always agendas, and which is why I always say you must read widely so you get both sides of the story.
Absolutely.
And
You
this
have
is the
to be
thing.
kind of clued. So it's not just being clued in to the like, oh, there's a different version. It's more about approaching the text, not
Yes,
as
critically.
And I feel like a friend of mine who worked for a university a while back, helping students with sort of basic skill sets that they come to university without. And the one thing she noticed is that there's such a fall in the ability to think critically among young people, and to the point where they use the term critical thinking, meaning literally finding things to be critical about, as opposed to what it actually is. And that is quite chilling when you sort of think about the university sort of producing the new kind of supposed intellectual elites of this country, and the reality is that people can't compare texts in a way to sort of try and glean at more than the words on the page. And
they've grown up in an era of misinformation, and this is something we didn't have to contend with, because we always had multiple viewpoints that we were like, okay, we can assess amongst these. But now you have social media and things like TikTok and things like that saying this is the truth and therefore you must believe it. And this is definitely hindering how people are thinking as society.
I mean, for sure. And going back to the we sort of focus on the royal family a little too much perhaps, but it's very interesting from kind of storytelling and sort of narrative voice point of view, because so something you mentioned about Prince Harry's book The Spare was that it sounded like it was sort of voice of a child. And I was wondering, in terms of a kind of comparing books about sort of similar events, same events, written in a sort of more analytic kind of grown-up tone of voice, and then written in the voice of a child. Do you think that like having this childlike voice sort of in a way increases credibility of a text to an extent, in the same way that it might undermine it in some respects, but kind of in terms of emotional impact?
Yeah, this is it. I think one of the biggest images that runs through the book, like the Barbara Streisand one about his mother, her mother, same thing with him. It's his mother. And, just this thought of she is immortalized in his life. And so it's like a spectre all the way through the book, where it's just like she was this magical being, because he was so young when he lost her. And so you can see this kind of childlike infatuation with his mother, where he hadn't seen these sort of flaws and stuff, not like his brother had. And so you can see this childlike voice all the way through, making mistakes where he's never really had any kind of parental support in the same way. And therefore it gives it credibility, and it almost makes you think, okay, we understand why he behaves in certain ways, because he's never had this sort of parental support. So I think if it was too analytical and written in a very historian type of view, like way, and it would not have gotten the same kudos as it did. And also it's so rare to get the voice of a monarch, of a royal, to actually talk about their story, because apart from Diana, it hasn't happened before. And so I think, Andrew Morton was the last really big story, which was for Diana. And this was the next one, which was like a huge, like almost 10, 15 years apart. So I think he got a good ghostwriter to really kind of capture that part of himself, which was this child that never really like kind of came to terms with the fact that his mother is just a human being.
I think that is a very powerful message. Right, it's a kind of a great origin story, really, and
Yeah,
in purely kind of narrative sense. But it's also this kind of, I think, the way we respond to stories that are less well curated in a way. I
mm,
think there is definitely a bit of an there has always been a slight sort of anti-intellectualist sort of
yeah,
streak running through
always.
society. So when we think about stories that we relate to, or stories that we are more likely to believe, is we tend to. That's why I think we relate more to anecdotal evidence, and we tend to form our opinions more in anecdotal evidence and emotional arguments
Yeah,
than we do in facts and statistics and like careful comparison of the laws and like an
yeah,
analysis of how certain bills and legislation might affect us, because we're thinking in emotional terms. And I think that might
yeah,
be, I think, but like when you are analyzing those books as a journalist, and you are lending your voice to retelling the story, that is certainly something you have to be aware of as well. And
yeah.
um, you know, how would you categorize your narrative voice? Say, for example, as a journalist.
Yeah, I think I differ in some respects because I think I've got a really strong HSP area, which is a highly sensitive person. So I've really strong mirror neurons in terms of empathy. So I have to be really careful when I read books because basically I can completely empathize with people, and that's slightly problematic. So I have to sometimes take a step back and just be like, okay, where has it not really worked? And I have to really think about that as well, where it's just like, okay, I really feel sorry for this character, this person, but at the same time, I really need to understand, for example, actually, no, the sentence structure was really bad, or it's just actually written really poorly, or and things like that. So I have to have a really critical way of looking at it because I can fall into that trap myself because I have such a strong empathy vibe for things. So yeah, unfortunately, it's a sort of a dangerous territory. I have to sort of to kind of manage. But I think if for example, there were a couple of books I read this, like autobiographies I read this year where I was just like, oh, that's really not okay, or where it has gotten a lot of kudos, and I was just like, no, we need to really think about what's been said here. So the Tupac Shakur book, for example, there was some really serious incidents in there. I said we can, create this hero myth around this man, but at the end of the day, he was convicted of a very serious crime, several very serious crimes, and we cannot sugarcoat the fact that he was convicted of rape, he was convicted of or assault of some kind, and then also even shooting police officers. So I was like, we cannot sugarcoat the fact that these things have happened. So when we're looking
Mm,
at it, we need to make sure also, okay, this author who wrote this book about him was a family friend, and therefore there will be this level of like, okay, I'm gonna just kind of create a distance. And I was like, we need to be a bit careful with things like that. And so I was just like, okay, if I'm writing a review, I'm going to say the fact that this happened, and
mhm.
we're not going to sugarcoat the fact that this happened, and we're not going to ignore that it's going to happen, because otherwise we're doing a disservice as well to
I
the readers.
I think like what you touched on here in terms of a family friend writing a
Yeah,
book, that is always an also an element of critical thinking and like
yeah,
critically analyzing the text and the story and the narrative that people want to portray. And especially when it comes to people who are popular for their beauty or for their
Yeah.
talents. When you look at Polanski, when you look
Oh
at Woody
God.
Allen,
Yeah.
and the way the way we kind of look at them is like we look at them through the prism of our own admiration for the work, and it's but that's I was thinking about that in the context of R. Kelly, and like how
Yeah. God.
there's all those there's the one narrative of an incredibly talented artist, and I
Yeah.
don't think anybody can deny
No.
him.
No.
It's like the whole world was singing "I Believe I Can Fly."
Yeah.
He is an incredibly talented and crafty crafty businessman in terms of he knew how to really connect with people in his music. But because we do like to have objective truths.
Yeah.
We like this to be the only story, and that's why it becomes so much harder to
Yeah.
superimpose that two things can be true at the same time.
Absolutely. Cognitive dissonance is a real thing. And I believe it's possible for so many people. Because if you think about all these stars that have done terrible things, a lot of things that haven't even come to the courts yet. And so it's very, very serious. The people that you really put on pedestals and things like that. And we know about Polanski and things like that. And honestly, it's okay to say the art that he created was incredible, but at the same time, he's not a great man.
I mean, I think it's just the aspirational aspect is so strong as well.
Yeah.
Like we kind of like to see ourselves in our heroes, and
Absolutely.
that is dangerous in a way that we make their story a part of our story.
Yeah.
And
We put them on pedestals.
exactly, and the moment you start sort of saying, like, I remember when Mother Teresa was
Oh,
synonymous with
yeah.
goodness, and when I was growing up, you would say like, well, you're trying to be a Mother Teresa, like and that was, even if you didn't know anything about her,
Yeah.
that was just so, in my language for sure, like, in Polish for sure, like it was just synonymous with goodness. And then if you have people who are talking about, I was this singer I really love, Nancy Griffith.
Mm.
She referenced Mother Teresa a lot in her songs about this kind of like, like, oh, I believe, and like, you could see Mother
Mm.
Teresa on TV and all that. And once that becomes part of your identity, then you feel that any attack on that
Yeah.
domineering story is an attack on you.
Absolutely. You defend it to the death because it means that also you've been believing a lie for so long that it's really hard to come to terms with that,
Mm.
that fact. And, that's why when I'm writing about these things, I did write about Mother Teresa in one of the articles that I wrote. I wrote both sides. I wrote that she did charity work, but we have to remember that she did a lot of bad things too.
And also
And
how she went about doing the charity work, I think, is the
absolutely
important question. Yeah.
really horrific, and I think the same even for like Gandhi. We saw that with Martin Luther King with the Jonathan Eakes book this year, which was incredible, which humanized Martin Luther King, which is great. And I think we need more books like that, which is let's humanize people, the good and the bad. That's why I
Yes.
really recommended the Jonathan Eakes book. I was just like, yeah, that's absolutely right. He wasn't perfect, and because no one is.
Yes, I think it's so important, and I love to hear that like this is your journalistic approach, because I definitely feel like people talk of polarization, but I see it among journalists as well, where they become more and more entrenched, and that to
Yeah.
me is the very opposite of what journalism is supposed to be, because you're
Yeah.
supposed to try and see things clearly while separating yourself and separating the
Yeah.
narratives that surround you from the facts on the ground. And like also when you mentioned social media and the kind of Twitter in the time of sort of Arab Spring,
Yeah.
and a friend of mine sort of co-edited book, Tweets from Tahrir,
Ah,
at the time, and that was this sort of fascination. There's this fascination with the like this is like truth without agenda. Like that's the
mhm,
idea, isn't it? Because you
yeah,
have, and that's what we have happening in Gaza at the moment as
yeah,
well, which is,
yeah,
and I've been hearing a lot about sort of coming out from sort of Israeli officials is that they have a young generation problem in
they
terms
do.
of their PR, because you do have, of course, people spreading lots of misinformation. I'm
Yeah,
not denying it on TikTok, and there is loads of
yeah,
false information,
hmm,
but there is also live footage
yeah,
coming in, and while you can disagree with analysis, you can disagree with someone coming out and saying this didn't happen like this happened. But if you see footage,
yeah,
live footage of what's happening in Gaza right now, or you can see live footage of Israeli soldiers saying things they really ought not to,
no,
um,
mm-mm,
that will change the story. And
yeah,
it becomes harder to control the story as well.
that's
And
it.
yeah, there's obviously good things about that, and then there's the who's curating this issue.
Yeah, definitely. It's so interesting because Vietnam was one of the first wars where you had actual images coming out real time.
Yes.
And those images completely changed the face of the war. The support they got on the ground was just like, you had thousands of students, like anti-war
Yes.
students, and so it really does make a huge difference having these young citizen journalists, basically risking their lives doing this. It's incredible work. And, one thing I found really interesting is that having lived in China, where censorship is such a, basically it's the apparatus that keeps the country together. It's incredible. It's impenetrable. Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. Whilst in Russia, they allowed open access to the media, to social media, which is their biggest downfall. Which is what's so interesting because if they had curated the way they censor in China, which is the Great Firewall, essentially the entire young population would be blinded by what's happening outside because
Hmm.
no one has access in China. Facebook's not there, Twitter doesn't exist, Google doesn't exist. So it's all just
Yeah.
on
They
Chinese
have their
media.
own extremely social media that is extremely
Absolutely.
censored as well.
Yeah.
But young people are crafty, and they are finding ways to create code speak.
Yes. Oh,
Um,
yeah. I've done a
that
whole
is,
analysis on because I had to learn about the Chinese lexicon about the what you call morphemes. They use to try and bypass the censors, and even then, it is quite the censorship is just really, really catastrophic over there. It's
mm,
so difficult to penetrate. They can, but it's so small the minority over there. Whilst in Russia, they allowed access to VK, they allowed access to all these different platforms, and it
mm,
just created a grassroots movement
for
there, which
sure.
doesn't exist in China.
I mean, the thing is that, but you have censorship on one side, and then you have sort of the pitfalls of free speech, in a
Yeah.
sense that, like, for one, we I don't think we have free speech in this country, in the UK.
No, no.
There's people being arrested all the
Yeah, yeah,
time
yeah.
uh on what, so when we think about free speech, that is not what we have.
No,
and
definitely not.
but also, when we do aspirationally speak of free speech, I remember I think it was oh my god, who was it who said that the price of free speech is constant vigilance. Who was
Yeah,
Nelson
yeah,
Mandela said, I think. So and I think for sure in this country we're slipping on the
yeah,
vigilance part. I think
massively.
we're definitely, and that is, and of course people like you, we rely on to try and maintain those sort of roads to sort of more dialogue and more understanding.
Yeah, just only not that long ago, about maybe even 9 months ago, when you had a journalist, an LBC journalist, she was arrested at a Just Oil protest for covering the protest.
Mm.
It was shocking. We were just like under no circumstance, under any humanitarian law, should media be arrested for doing their job. And to see that happen in this country this year, and seeing more and more freedoms being curtailed against free speech, especially for the press, it really is very concerning. And there has to be some very, very strong distinction when it comes to free speech, freedom of expression, and hate speech. And that's where this is all starting to destabilize massively, because there is no distinction, and therefore one is allowed and one isn't allowed, and then it just sort of blurs, essentially.
I think people's definition of hate speech has become a lot. The definitions have become much looser and much more subjective, and
absolutely.
You cannot, especially when you're talking about legal terms. I think there should be no space for subjective kind of interpretation here, because once the laws are supposed to be there also for the worst case scenario, like when someone tries to take the argument sort of ad absurdum. Where do we kind of define things more clearly?
Yeah, absolutely. And X is now, or Twitter, or whatever it's going to be called next year, it's just become just a platform for full-on hate speech, and there is no responsibility from tech organizations.
I mean,
with
honestly, having been on Twitter for a while, I've seen so much hatred on
oh my god,
all sides, all political views.
it's
and like,
awful.
I've
Terrible.
seen levels, and it was a mess long before Elon
It
Musk
was
took over. I think now it's just bots hating on each other, which in a way is less horrible to me because at least nobody's watching it.
See, I wish that was true, but I had
Yeah.
so many friends who were content moderators, and they did such a great job in just managing it. And having worked 7 years with open source intelligence, it was easy to manage because you were able to filter it. But this is uncontrollable.
They were all
this is
fired,
why
isn't it?
It's completely just everyone was fired. So we're talking about like a workforce of 5,000 people were fired. And then basically now it's almost impossible to kind of maneuver through this just junkyard of people with megaphones.
I think unless it's turned around in some way, I think because it's the main thing that brings people, to information, and like what you were talking about, the two sort of book on the royals, is that people are more drawn to things that bring them positive emotions. So, Twitter has become unpleasant. And I think the biggest issue with Twitter right now is that it's become less entertaining and more unpleasant, and than the disinformation itself. Because I remember the level of the disinformation, obviously during sort of Trump presidency, during kind of COVID pandemic, all of that was so clearly disinformation on its own doesn't affect people's willingness to engage with content. It's more about how pleasant the experience is made for them, which is a different danger altogether, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the thing is that we've reached a stage where people's mental health is just deteriorated so much so that they're willing to listen to anything that makes them feel good. And that is the truth. We've had more than 11 years of austerity in this country, and it has taken a toll on people, to the point that it's easy to start shouting, easy to point at people to say they're the problems. They're the problem causing all of this issue. And so I think years and years of mismanagement has caused this
For
situation now.
sure. And of course, it's apparently becoming quite apparent that Gen Z is the generation with sort of the most mental health issues
Yeah.
of all sort of historically
Yeah.
thing. And they were supposed to be the generation that saves us. So, what's
Yeah.
up with that?
Yeah.
They were supposed to be the ones with the balance between like life and mental health and all that. And it's become apparent that actually this approach isn't working either. So we need to find a way to kind of rebalance things a little bit.
It's really interesting because the Reuters Institute releases a really important media document and analysis every year, and very much the consensus is that Gen Z is completely off news. They absolutely hate news now. They will not engage with any brand, and the only thing they'll engage with is social media. And the only part of social media they'll engage with is positive social media. So they are fed up of just this angry, hateful news, and understandable because obviously everyone's just getting super depressed at the moment. But what they're looking for is solution-focused news, which I thought was really interesting. There is much more suddenly like solution-focused news organizations being created. So, for example, I have behind me somewhere the Happiness newspaper, which basically is a newspaper just for positive news. And every time you buy a copy, it plants a tree, plants several trees, and that's the kind of thing that people are starting to, actually cater, like, get more excited about.
I mean,
so,
I can see the like really good things about it, and I can also see the real danger in that.
yes, because it's ignoring. Yeah.
Yes. So this has sort of come to the end. I could continue talking to you for many more hours.
Yeah.
I think we've covered quite a lot. So thank you, Shashti, for coming onto the show and
Oh, no, my
this
pleasure.
wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me.
So if you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. It really helps the channel, and maybe that notification bell too. And see you again next week.